So do you want to take that from the top?
Excellent. Okay.
Yeah.
So the thesis that I want to get across, and I mean, maybe I want to explore it more than necessarily prove it, because you might prove me wrong as we go along, and that would also be fine.
Mm-hmm.
But is that the cultural 60s? So that's as opposed to the historical, like the actual time period. I mean, like everyone's idea of what you mean when you say the 60s. So that's probably like 1965 to 1973 or something like that. The idea that that was this great kind of instant flashpoint of catalyzed social change that altered everything forever. I kind of think that that is retrospective mythologizing by the people who lived through it or wish that they lived through it.
Mm.
And I think that there was a lot of social change that happened in that period, but I think that the sorts of people who went to the Woodstock Music Festival had a lot less to do with it than they claim. And I also think that um, there were quite serious personal costs for a lot of the kind of experimentation that people were trying to do, and that those costs weren't paid by the people who were doing the experimentation often.
Mm-hmm. I heard a quote, which I want to give to you, that I've desperately been trying to find the source of, and I only can give you the spirit of the quote, not the word, and I have no idea what the source is, and it's possible that I dreamed it. The quote is that the cultural impact of the social revolution of the 60s was approximately that of a sponge cake dropped from 6 feet.
Yeah, yeah. So I mean, that's as good a place to start as any. So as I was saying before you hit record, I opened like 2 dozen tabs so that I could be sure that I wasn't telling lies.
Mm.
So as a starting example, the estimated attendance at the Woodstock Festival is about 400,000 people, which is, that's a decent size of music festival. But the US population in 1969 was 202 million.
Mm.
So that's a huge number of lives that remain untouched by this supposedly like utterly pivotal moment.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I was the thing that first started me down this. I'm going to be anecdotal, if you'll forgive me.
Please do.
Is that when I worked for the Access radio station in Dunedin, we had this lovely old bloke who came in and did a music show. And we had this idea about getting people who were associated with the radio station to like do other things that would be of interest. And we knew that he'd been a film projectionist. So he came in and gave a talk about that. And he'd been a film projectionist all the way through the historical 60s, because he started in like 1959 and finally gave it up in the mid 80s or early 90s.
Wow.
Um, and someone who was in attendance at his talk asked about, so what about all of this hippie stuff? What about the kind of the 60s? He said, oh, that just completely passed me by and I didn't notice it at all.
Huh. Do you think that that's for geographic reasons, given the slowness of communication in those days, or do you think that that is a reflection of the limited impact and mythologization of the quote-unquote 60s?
I think it's the latter, and I think it's the latter because also anecdotally, my mum as a teenager in Nelson, she would have been a teenager in the 60s. Her and all of her friends would like go round to the house of whoever had the new weird hippy dippy record from America or the UK, and listen to it and just kind of avidly consume this stuff. So like there was definitely a slice of the population for whom this was hugely impactful, but there
Mm.
were also people who were just utterly untouched by it.
Mm. Yeah, similarly, my mother went to art school in the 70s, and she said that they used to listen to all of that. First there is a mountain, then there is no mountain, then there is stuff.
Yeah, and I want to be clear that, like, as far as art from the 1960s, I I still have some fondness for it. I find it, like, I find a lot of it very comforting, because I really like listening to people who feel like that they're changing the world somehow.
Mm.
I enjoy being in the presence of that kind of optimism, but at the same time, like, the more I read and the more I find out about what was going on, um, the more hollow it seems in some ways, and also the more it seems like it's given rise to some current trends which are quite dangerous.
Well, this runs us into a problem.
Mm.
I have a similar feeling. When I look at the art and music of the 60s, there's something about it that I enjoy, but I suspect that what I enjoy about it is the naivety and sincerity. And if we accept the idea that we live in an age where the only way to access naivety and sincerity is through nostalgia, because we live in a time that is irony poisoned and insincere, it becomes impossible for us to look back and have an objective judgment about whether or not those times were in fact sincere, or whether or not we're projecting on our nostalgia and our desires for sincerity onto them.
Yeah, I accept that. I mean, I think I think that there were some people who were sincerely taken in, at least by the projection of what was going on. Like, again, to be anecdotal and talk about my parents, to hear my dad talk about the way that his encounters with the kind of psychedelic folk scene that was happening for a while in the 1960s in Scotland was
Mm.
that at least initially, for him, experientially, there was something that felt incredibly powerful and pure and spontaneous about it, and that was quite intoxicating, aside from any intoxicants that may have been going around.
Sure.
Uh,
Well, yeah, my father-in-law reports a very similar thing. He was working in Kew Gardens in London in the 60s, and he said that it was a thing that seemed to grow and come out of either nowhere or from inside themselves into this kind of massive pulsing wave that blew outwards from there without necessarily a deep level of understanding or really any analysis of it whatsoever.
Yeah, and I think maybe the analysis and the understanding is where things start to go wrong, because my the more that I read, the more it seems like, in order for example, Donovan to say first there is a mountain and then there is no mountain and then there is, or for Cat Stevens to genuinely say that he loves his dog as much as he loves you, or the Incredible String Band to say that when they were born they had no heads.
Mm.
Um, like, there had to be this architecture of people who were not having that kind of transcendent experience, because they were pushing buttons and turning knobs and pulling levers,
Mm.
and some of them were quite mercenary about it, and some of them were creative about it, but creative in a very, like, here's the thing you've given me to fix and make good, so my job is to make it as good as possible, kind
Mm.
of, like, that's the kind of attitude that they had to the music.
Mm. Well, I mean, there's so many strands that we can pull apart here. So let's start on the task of pulling apart some of those strands. And one of the ones I want to acknowledge is that there's always been a darkness inside it. Retrospectively, it's easy to only see the glow and the aura of the 60s, but you listen to Season of the Witch or something like that, and it's clear that these songs are not just quote unquote protest songs, they also represent something that's dark inside the people that are singing them. because this is the exact current that leads out of the 60s into the 70s that manifests itself as Black Sabbath and all of that kind of thing, right? I mean, you are deeper in this music than I am, but am I right in thinking that there's a direct connection between those in that current?
Yeah, I think there is. I think that Black Sabbath, if we want to head in that direction, we can do that in a second. Black Sabbath are what happen when people who are, instead of like um, art school people or folkies, they are at least initially fairly untutored um, working class people who are trying to escape a working class reality, get their hands on electric instruments and entirely customize the sound to reflect what's going on with them, kind of
Mm,
from the ground up.
mm,
But also, I think even without going in a musical direction, I think the darkness that's there is also the darkness that leads to the Manson family and that leads to Jim Jones and that leads to Scientology. Like I
mm,
think that there was a moment where uh, there was this concept that the old way was bad and wrong, and so you had to discard it. But in doing that, there was this acceptance of like everything for a brief moment. Like that's where you get like the start of people who would go on and become foundational members of NAMBLA. Um,
right.
like there's this moment here in its chorus of like sexual acts to freak out the squares has pederasty in with like cunnilingus.
Yeah.
um,
Mm,
like there's this moment where it's all up for grabs, and some really unscrupulous people did a lot of grabbing really fast.
mm. Well, in terms of the 60s, Vietnam is constantly referenced. But what I don't understand is why the Cold War is not understood as a deeper impact. If we accept that the Cold War began almost immediately after the Second World War, or at the latest when Russia first got nuclear weapons, then it couldn't have been more than 10 years to the beginning of the 60s, or maybe 15, I don't have the historical dates. And I would have thought that the cultural and geopolitical contest between Russia and the United States, or between NATO and the Warsaw Pact, would have had more of a psychic impact on the development of the cultural current that turned into the quote unquote 60s. But instead, it seems to be Vietnam, and I assume that's only because of the personal experiences that were involved, in the sense that if you're a Cold Warrior or the child of a Cold Warrior, probably what you're not doing is moving to Haight-Ashbury.
Yeah, so I think that there's truth in that, and I think that the Cold War probably was background radiation for these people, because the 50s, when all of these people are kids, is the era of like what's his name? This is one of the things I didn't put in the tab. The turtle, the duck and cover turtle.
Oh, Duck and Carver.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
remember
no,
the
that's
campaign. I don't remember the
yeah.
turtle.
So I mean, the people who moved to Haight Ashbury and didn't, but people of that generation are the people who grew up having their cartoons interrupted by the duck and cover turtle.
Mm,
So that's definitely in there. But I think the thing about Vietnam is um, it's like the anti-nuclear movement in the 80s and the anti-tour movement in the 80s in New Zealand, in the sense that it's like a massive political cultural conflict where there was actually a decisive outcome.
mm,
Like
mm-hmm,
America did eventually leave Vietnam, and I mean, I think that's because the opposition to the war had expanded far beyond hippies and radicals and pretty ordinary people were looking at the war, and even if they didn't much care about killing Vietnamese people, they were starting to see the cost in terms of US lives as unacceptable.
Well,
Um,
what do you think of this analysis that the Cold War was fought by the upper class, i.e., policy analysts, generals, people in high position in Washington, whereas Vietnam, the impact was felt purely by blue collar men, essentially?
yeah, I think so, and I think also when you start to see the impact of the Cold War bite on culture, that's to my mind that's like the late 70s through the 80s.
Mm.
That comes into culture in things like When the Wind Blows, that comic that
Oh,
became
God.
a movie.
How could I
Yeah,
forget?
yeah,
Yeah.
traumatic memories are us.
Well,
Also, I
yeah.
forgot what the other thing was that I was going to say, but I feel like um, that's a reaction to the sense in which that war began to feel like permanent and immovable. Um, Whereas I think that part of the optimism of the hippie thing was this idea that they would win because they were right and everyone would just see that they were right.
Mm. Well, if I can ask you a more personal question, because we were both boys at the end of the Cold War, how cognizant were you of the Cold War as a child?
So I didn't really understand it until I was quite a bit older, but the knowledge that there was something to do with America and Russia, and because we moved to the UK when I was 6, so that would have been 1987. Um, the UK was in on it too, and that was really dangerous somehow.
Mm.
That was in my head because my mum was in on the anti-nuclear marches and things, and so I was taken to. I have like vague memories of being at anti-nuclear marches as quite a small child and seeing like big people dressed as Uncle Sam on stilts and finding them very frightening just because they were like big scary people on stilts.
Yeah.
Um, so I had that kind of relationship with it until I was a bit older and began to kind of understand what was actually going on. But my kind of like ability to do any sort of analysis probably coincided with the fall of the Berlin Wall. You
Mm.
know, like that I wouldn't have understood much before then, I don't think.
I remember seeing the Berlin Wall come down and not knowing anything about it except that it was something really big and important that was happening.
Mm,
Yeah.
mm.
My experience of the tail end of the Cold War was having nightmares about the bomb and being shocked when Sting sang "If the Russians Love Their Children Too," and we're hearing him say that. My reaction being, "Well, how could you say that?" Right?
Yeah, yeah, I can see that. Although, like I say, my awareness was just that there were people doing bad things and they were dressed like Uncle Sam.
Yeah. Um, yeah, I wonder how much of my cognizance of the end of the Cold War is because my parents were involved in the tail end of the cultural thrust that came from the 60s, returning us back to the original topic.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, look, that's very possible because my parents, although they were very much of that mindset to start with, they both went into medical science, into healthcare, and that's there's politics to psychiatry, but the politics to psychiatry are about like, are you sanely reacting to an insane world, or can we say that there is something wrong with you? Like that's the argument. It's not like is the nuclear war is the Cold War wrong? That's kind of not material.
So, is there a thread from the '60s that you'd like to draw out?
Well, so I guess the reason that I thought that this was a discussion worth having is that um, I I feel like some of the tradition of credulity, if you like, that opened the door to people like Jim Jones and Charlie Manson, and also to the Scientologists and the more abusive bits of the Hare Krishnas and so on and so forth. Um, it is the thing that kind of continued through the 70s and 80s and is now leading people who run dance festivals in New Zealand to become like David Icke and QAnon people. So I think that's a concern, and I think that there's a thread that starts there and continues through. The other thing, I guess, is that I feel like there's a conversation we probably need to have about the willingness to deal with violence, because I feel like there were some really big gains made in terms of social change in that historical period, but those were often done by people who were either prepared to do violence or were prepared to be non-violent in the sense of like allowing significant violence to be done to yourself in order to demonstrate your position, and also to burn any goodwill that your opponent might have. And I feel like that that's where um, that's where the hippies often had less skin in the game, because you can cut your hair and get a real job, and then you're not a hippie anymore. But if you're a Black Panther, then you're a Black Panther because the cops are probably going to shoot you regardless.
There's definitely a familial lineage that comes down to all of the modern day protest movements that existed in that go back to and exist inside the 60s, and I imagine a historian who's better educated on this topic than me would be able to track those prior to it as well. My sense is that the protest movements of the 60s um, essentially derived from the Quaker and sorry, not Quaker, the ranters and levellers of the 16th and 17th centuries, skip a few generations and then into the 60s, and then from there into the protest movements of the 80s, and then into the modern day. Excuse me.
It's an excellent noise.
It's the least offensive cell phone alert I could find. So, all right, here's a question for you. How much influence did Russia have in the West on the development of the 60s protest movements? And was that influence a deliberate, cynical attempt at subversion, and how much of it was a faithful attempt to spread credulous ideology?
So that's a really interesting question. And to be honest, I don't know the answer. My sense is that, and this is based on reading the accounts of people like Jean Le Carre, who actually worked as a spy before he wrote his spy books. My sense is that both the US and Russia greatly exaggerated the extent to which their spying operations were effective. Um, I think that there was definitely a strong left wing and anti capitalist component to the protest movements, but I mean, left wing and anti capitalist movements in America are not new. Um, there was the first. I listened to a podcast called Behind the Bastards, which is an account of bad people throughout history.
Mm.
Um, and one of the episodes of that was an account of the first war or the first battle on American soil to use air power against an entrenched position, and that was an armed conflict between mine bosses and miners.
Wow.
And the miners, the mine bosses tried throwing, I think it was throwing dynamite out of planes at them or something. But
Yeah.
like the Russia didn't need to engender communism or anarchism in America for it to be there. I think the process
Yeah.
is more to do with a shifting, and Alexei Sayle talks about this actually in his autobiography, because he was raised by hardcore communists. Um, he talks about how the process was more about shifting from idolizing Russia to realizing what Russia was actually like, and less about necessarily being recruited by them, more about deliberately reaching out because you were already sympathetic, and then getting in touch and finding out that everything was kind of awful because Stalin.
Well, yeah, and sets me up perfectly to ask the inverse question: to what degree is the protest movements and the 60s the result of deliberate intelligence operations by the Americans? Like, to what degree can we say that the CIA was a central actor in the creation of and maintenance of the quote unquote the 60s? Because there's definitely some connections there. It's just the scale that is difficult to determine.
Yeah, and it's difficult to determine because we're talking about the actions of a secret service by definition, like, hide what they're doing,
Mm.
um, and so it's there's probably like another 50 years before we get all of the records about who did what, because the CIA is very fond of going, okay, well, these records are now able to be whatever the American version of Official Information Act, I think it's FOIA maybe, but like,
Mm-hmm.
these records are now able to be requested by the public. Enjoy your 300 pages of Black Sharpie.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, for
so
those of the listeners who are interested in the topics of the JFK assassination and Watergate, I recommend listening to the Pseudodoxology podcast, who have done extremely in-depth and extremely thorough deep dives on those two subjects, and they're extremely rewarding, assuming that you have the 4 hours or 7 hours that it takes to listen to the complete versions of those podcasts.
yeah. I mean, what we know for certain is, and well, what I'm saying that we know for certain, because and regretting it because I now can't remember my source for it, but was that a shift towards, for want of a better term, psychedelicization
Mm.
was a deliberate strategy by the CIA. There was a conscious attempt by the CIA to introduce influential members of protest and counterculture organizations to narcotics of various kinds, and to shift their interests in that direction.
Mm.
Um,
I
and I
remember
think,
I remember reading Timothy Leary said that he was dragged into the back of the limousine and had 1,000,000 hits of acid thrust into his hands for the purposes of distribution. And similarly, some people, and I have no way of verifying these claims, so they should be taken with the smallest grain of salt available, that similarly anybody working at the CIA couldn't be certain that there wasn't going to be LSD in their coffee in the morning because their people they worked with thought it was funny to see them run around or whatever. And also at a cultural level, and with a similar degree of certitude, that the CIA pioneered varieties of abstract art as genres, as forms of American art, specifically as a way to attack and denigrate the kind of Soviet realism style that was being propagated out of the
Yeah,
Warsaw Pact.
that's actually where we get Jackson Pollock from. Was this drive to promote American modernism as um, the flower of capitalist culture, if you like. I think there's an interesting thing, um, kind of reading between the lines of the concept of uh, turning people onto drugs as a way of blunting a movement, because I think that one of the things that I see as a fundamental flaw in the '60s protest movement that leads to its disintegration, and leads to so many people who'd been hippies then becoming yuppies, is that it's like a psychedelic experience, even though famously it creates fellow feeling for other entities, as part of the experience. It's also intensely personal, and I think that that if the CIA were smart, which they may well not be because they did some fucking clown shoes shit as well. These are also the people who wanted Fidel Castro's beard to fall out because they thought it would rob him of his machismo. Um, that like that if they had their thinking heads on, the concept of getting something which seemed like it might be a credible threat to an individualist economic order, and then getting those people wrapped up in their own heads, having very individual experiences, instead of participating in some sort of collectivist action, would be an effective tactic.
Mm. The thing that I'm most skeptical about inside that analysis is that when I look at the 60s, it appears to be a mess.
Yeah,
That
yeah, I think that's a fair analysis. I think there was a lot of stuff happening at once, and I think Alan Moore's analysis is cogent as always about, conspiracy theorists like the idea that there is one person in charge. Actually, there are like 500 all getting in each other's way and tripping each other up. There is
mm,
no one ultimately in charge, and the world is rudderless.
mm, yeah, it's a cutting remark. I I'm skeptical of psychological explanations of anything, but I think that one really shows something that it is difficult to be psychologically stable and to believe that you live in a universe that is appearing to progress through some form of Brownian motion.
Yeah, I think that is I mean, it's a very frightening thought, particularly if you've been raised in a philosophy which holds that there is some sort of arc to society in any given direction, as opposed to people frantically trying to steer a very large, slow turning boat.
Mm.
I guess so. I mean, another thing, another reason that I wanted to have this discussion is that I still hold uh, the view that the world could be better in some ways, and I feel like, sometimes looking at the ways in which things failed or didn't work as expected, is like, do you know about Abraham Wald?
I never heard of him.
So Abraham Wald is a statistician from World War II, and he's the guy who is famous amongst aeroplane nerds for introducing the concept of survivorship bias into analyzing the damage that was done to bomber planes.
So this was the man who recognised that you should armour the parts of the planes that weren't shot through full of holes when the planes got home.
Exactly. That's the guy who
Right,
realized that what we were learning was the places that you could shoot a plane and it would keep working.
Yeah.
And so I think like that kind of analysis can be useful if you're interested in, I don't know, running a functional protest movement or looking at protest movements that are currently active and trying to see if they are worth throwing your weight behind, or you've got a group of people who are outside the mainstream in some way, and you're anxious to have it not colonized by predators, because the number of stories from people in niche scenes of their scene being colonized by predators that I hear is just kind of terrifying.
So, if you were to apply a Wallsian analysis to the 60s, what lessons would you draw?
I think that if you want to... So first thing, I think if you want to look at what action seems like it was most likely to have concrete effects in terms of achieving the kind of world that people were after, you should probably look at the kinds of action that attracted the most state violence. I think that's a good guide to where the government was worried about things. And what that seems to be, and again, I'm not a trained historian, I'm a trained sound engineer, but what that seems to be is people like the Black Panthers and the Diggers who were feeding people and meeting community needs so that the communities were not in such a perilous situation. Like that.
What was the state reaction to the Diggers? Because I only know of them from the covers of 60s records.
So the original Diggers, who are like 17th century, were massacred. The 1960s Diggers were basically marketinged out of existence. So they were essentially a social support organization, an anti-capitalist, anarchist social support organization who sprang up around the original Haight-Ashbury community, which was a fairly, that's like one intersection in San Francisco. That's a fairly small group of people. And what happened was that as hippie became a marketing term, and people began to migrate to Haight-Ashbury, in their thousands. They were hopelessly overwhelmed and just utterly unable to cope with the rate of people coming in and needing help, and also with people beginning to actually like abuse the community as well as live in it and need assistance.
Yeah.
So they basically held a protest march in 1967 entitled "The Death of Hippie," where someone rode around in a coffin labeled "Hippie, the son of the media," and pallbearers pointed mirrors back at the crowd.
Yeah.
But then they kind of faded into obscurity and ended up doing various things, in some cases getting very bitter and becoming junkies.
Yeah. Although it is worth pointing out there was that prior to the hippies, all of the social movements that fed into it were vigorously staffed with junkies as well.
Oh yeah, no, I mean the presence of heroin in American countercultures is also not a new thing, and we can also thank the CIA for escalating that particular trade.
Yeah, and if we compare that to the state reaction against the Black Panthers, which was very much more a variety of both information warfare and just physical suppression in terms of shooting people. In fact, I think one of the Panther houses was bombed, if I remember
Yeah, no,
correctly.
the cops dropped a bomb on a block in I think Chicago, but I might be wrong about that. But yes, the
Yeah.
cops definitely bombed a Black Panther house and
Mm.
leveled the surrounding block essentially,
Well,
because they were so worried about them.
it begs the question, if the Black Panthers are a black nationalist communist movement, were the cops operating against blacks, against nationalists, or against communists? And I ask that question specifically as it was coming on the tail end of the destruction of Rhodesia, which was overwhelmed by black Marxist nationalists funded from Russia that kind of eventually drove Rhodesia into the ground. And I wonder how much the interplay of those forces caused that reaction, because obviously we could interpret it as anti-communist action, seeing as it was during the Cold War. We could interpret it as anti-black action, seeing as it was during or immediately after Jim Crow. And we could interpret it as anti-nationalist action, seeing as the United States is, at the very least theoretically, a liberal capitalist Enlightenment endeavour.
So I think you most usefully, I suspect, look at it as both anti-black and anti-communist, and the reason that those two fit together is that historically there has been a very blurred line between anti-communist as opposed to philosophically in favor of liberal capitalism,
Mm,
um, and actually fascist.
mm,
Those have been code terms for one another, and they shade into one another. So I think that because of the relationship with fascism, which America has a cozy and difficult history with.
well,
um,
I should point out we need to be extremely cautious with that term, because depending on who you ask, fascism can mean anything from genocidal authoritarianism to just trade unionism.
Oh, right. Okay. Let me be more specific. I mean people who sympathized strongly with the Nazis, and in some cases, actual Nazis who
Right.
left Germany at the end of World War II and settled in America.
Right, this
Um,
is the
I
CIA's Operation Paperclip that brought in Werner von Braun and everybody else in
yeah,
order to. Yeah,
and Werner von Braun. You can watch him on Disney Plus right now,
yeah,
because Disney Plus have put up one of the Disney company's old films about how glorious humanity's quest for space flight is, and there's Werner von Braun talking about rocket technology.
yeah.
He's right there. You can go watch him if you
Well,
subscribe to the thing.
well, this is exactly it. We need to be really careful. Oh, sorry, we need to look at me dictating things. I think it's really important that I acknowledge that there's no such thing as purity in the world. A really good example of that is the way that every modern green and environmental movement essentially sources its analysis back to Heidegger, who was the cultural and intellectual force behind the Nazi Party and gave it its validity from an academic perspective. So none of us are pure, is the point that I'm trying to make there.
No, and I think that because you may or may not be aware of this, but my wife is a city councillor who got into the city council on a Green Party ticket,
Mm.
and so we are tied up with the local branch of the Green Party. We were instrumental in helping out Tiana Tuiono in getting into Parliament.
Mm.
My wife was one of his campaign managers, and so the the contact when you're inside that particular tent, you do have contact with people who will still have some of that philosophy in their thinking. We've had to deal with people who are still on Malthus.
Right.
The problem is that there are too many low quality people.
Yeah.
Not The problem is that we are distributing resources in an intensely unequal way, and also shoveling as much fuel as we can into the go faster wreck shit machine as
Mm.
we possibly can.
Mm.
Um, uh, those things are not, to my mind, inherently connected, but there are definitely people in modern green movements who see them as connected.
All right. Well, let me ask a more provocative question then. What lessons have modern right-wing movements most successfully taken from the quote-unquote 60s?
So I think the thing that right wing uh, movements have been very effective at, and partly this is because, particularly in America, although I think it's probably the case in New Zealand as well. If you look at, for example, the bombing of the trade union hall where Ernie Abbott was killed,
Mm.
that crime was never solved, and I am skeptical as to how unsolvable it genuinely was.
Mm.
Um, but um, Partly because there is a more sympathetic relationship between right wing agitators and the police than between left wing agitators and the police. They can get away with a bit more, but also they're they're very very good at uh, overlooking um, philosophical disagreements in order to gain temporary goals. Um, and I don't know that that's a thing that the left can always do, because there are, I suspect, more deal breakers there for people. But
Well, the
for
political
example,
tradition of the left is a circular firing squad, right? Whereas the political tradition of the right, and tell me if you agree with this or not, is order above disorder.
yeah, no, I think that can be the case, and I think that that's why things like just feed the kids is so powerful, because it sort of doesn't matter who's doing it. If your kids are hungry and you can't feed them and someone does,
Mm.
then you're at least slightly on side with them. That's
Mm.
how we had that weird moment in New Zealand where people were kind of okay with the gangs for a bit, because they were making sandwiches for hungry school kids and nobody else was doing that.
Yeah.
Um, I think so. I mean, I think the right are very good at disregarding temporary disagreements in order to gain ground. I think the other thing that they've done is that they have done a lot of um, kind of practical, boring work. Um, there's a book, a free book that you can get as an ebook called "The War on Everyone," which is a history of the rise of right wing terror in America.
Mm.
And one of the things that I didn't know, that's detailed in this book, is that in the 1970s, there was this group of right wing armed uh, insurrectionists, terrorists, agitators, whatever you want to call them, who called themselves the Order after a very racist book,
Wow.
um,
I
the
never heard of
Turner
him.
Diaries.
Yeah.
Well, they carried out a whole bunch of armored van robberies,
Mm-hmm.
and they sunk all of the money that they got from doing that into computers and computing. And as a consequence, the American white supremacist right wing has been on the internet longer than any other activist tendency in America.
Wow, that's fascinating. I had no idea.
Yeah, and so like there is this like really practical strand to these guys sometimes, even
Yeah,
though I don't think that their philosophy is practical.
it's interesting because it's funny the way that terrorism has changed its meaning so much over the years, especially before and after 9/11. But if you were to say to me, who were the primary terrorists of the 1970s in the United States, I would naturally go to the Weather Underground.
Mm.
Yeah. Or similarly, if you asked a similar question about Europe, you would say like the Baader Meinhof gangs or something like that. I wonder how
Yeah,
much.
and I think,
Yeah.
oh, sorry, I think that they were much better at like public theatre,
Mm-hmm.
but the order weren't especially interested in public theatre at that particular point in time.
Yeah, a really good case study of this is the Saul Alinsky book, Rules for Radicals. The left-wing protest movements have been using the Rules for Radicals framework from the time it was published and are still using it now. And I'm not intimately familiar with right politics, but to the degree that they weren't using Rules for Radicals, I think was not because they were not aware of it. I think that they were not using it because the right is interested in order and in maintaining the traditional nation, both as a people and as a state. And if you have two groups fighting against each other using the Saul Alinsky method, what you're doing is dividing the state into two smaller states rather than maintaining the larger structure while the larger structure is fighting against internal rebellion. And that turnaround, that change of going, we're fighting an internal enemy for the purpose of keeping the state together, the shift from that to keeping the state together is no longer really a viable option, so there's no reason not to use Saul Alinsky's methods, I think is a contributing factor to the division that we see. And I don't want to tread too far into US modern day politics because everything seems to be about that these days. But you see where I'm going with that, right?
Yeah, no, I do, and I think also that the the advantage that the right has is that also they tend to be operating in the interests of people who already hold power, and so
That's interesting.
it's
I
well, I mean, in the sense that whether or not someone on the street feels like the women and the transes and the darkies have gone too far and they want theirs back, you kind of man down the pub right wing. That's a very crude analysis. I'm sure there are people who hold right wing views despite being working class and have more subtle analyses, but that one will do for now.
mm,
Um, if that guy gets what they want, then the person who owns the place where they work also gets what they want.
see. I find that a really interesting point of disagreement. My impression is that both the left and the right think that the other holds hegemonic power in their society. My analysis of where the right is at the moment is that they regard themselves as a beleaguered minority fighting against a massive structural state-empowered machine that is intent on deracinating and depowering their kind of traditional communities. And so the impression that I get is that the left looks at the centre and thinks they're the right, and the same thing is going on. The right looks at the centre and think that that's the left. So neither of them are really realistically engaging with the other, and instead what you've got is both of them are reacting against centrist neoliberalism. And to extend the analysis, I think that in all Western democracies, the two major parties are essentially centralist, bureaucratic, policy-oriented neoliberal parties. And to be clear, I'm not condemning that. I'm just trying to set up the
No,
dynamic.
I, I think you're entirely right about that. I mean, I've seen a lot of lefty people I know on the internet jumping up and down and making wailings and gnashings of teeth about the New Zealand government failing to take radical action in various ways, and I think that that is entirely to be expected. The New Zealand Labour Party, at the very least since the 1980s, has been a very centrist organisation, and a lot of the personnel within that party are long-standing careerist politicians
Mm,
who've got where they are by having, you know, policy nous and being sharp operators to some degree, and not by being, wild-eyed radicals throwing Molotovs at things.
yeah.
And similarly, I think the majority of the National Party, um, at least again since the 1980s, have not been um, cigar smoking people who grind their shoes on small children's faces, or whatever the caricature is. In fact, um, I think you can argue that the most recent uh, attempt during the election was an attempt to appeal to a meaner style of right wing politics, and it was roundly rejected because um, collectively we don't like it when people are mean to one another, whether or not they're right. Um,
Well, let me set up the
yeah,
context a little for our if we have any international audience. New Zealand's economy was essentially state managed up until the early 80s, where we went through the most rapid and deep cutting liberal, and I mean market liberal, reforms. And that caused a lot of pain, but also led to New Zealand's economy being extremely competitive internationally, such that we're now in a position where many of us are making a lot of money, but also a fair number of us are not. Uh,
mm,
yeah. So, I'm just adding that economic history there for our other listeners.
yeah, no, and I think an extra note there that's worth mentioning is that the party. So for a long time, New Zealand politics was a duopoly.
Mm,
The first past the post system meant that we were a lot like Britain. We had the National Party, which was roughly analogous to the British Conservative Party, and the Labour Party, which was the Labour Party. Um, and the party that undertook those reforms in the early 1980s, at least initially, was a Labour government, and
yeah,
that
that's a great point.
has
That's absolutely true.
that's done weird things to the psyche of the New Zealand left in particular. There are people still writing on politics in New Zealand today who don't know how to process that yet in the year of our Lord 2020.
Yeah. And well, I should make those people stop and think. Well, here's another question. To what degree do you think that the rights claims to represent the working class man is valid, or valid is the wrong term, sincerely held, and to what degree is it a cynical maneuver, do you think?
So, I mean, I'm fairly lefty,
Mm,
and so my tendency is to assume often that that right wing points are being put disingenuously, and I acknowledge that as a weakness in my political thinking that I need to be aware of.
mm-hmm.
But I will say that historically, right wing populist movements have and I include fascism as a right wing populist movement incidentally. It was,
Okay.
it was in Germany, it was strongly supported by like small business holders who thought, this Hitler bloke is going to make stuff better for us.
Well, they came to
And he
power in
did.
a democratic election, right? So,
Yeah, yeah,
in
yeah,
that
they
sense,
did,
it's
and
yeah,
they did make life better for small business holders by taking other small businesses off dues and giving them to approved small business holders, which is one way of doing it. Um, so there, where I was going was there is a historical precedent for right wing populist movements saying we are going to fix everything by getting rid of an identifiable enemy within the population. Like, that's what we need to do. And then your job, making sausages, sweeping floors, being down a coal mine, will be better than it was before.
yeah,
And generally speaking, that doesn't happen. I think you could point at the situation that people in the lower socioeconomic demographics in America are in. I mean, it's boring to talk about American politics, but we do have a fairly authoritarian leader who has been in power and is on his way out. And so you can look at that and watch what's happened. I think, I think that there's there's more than a small hint of the prosperity gospel in it, to my view. But that said, I intermittently work with a guy who is significantly to the right of me, and he makes a number of interesting points in the sense that the ways in which our centre-left government has responded to genuinely tragic events, and I think that they took generally the right tack doing it. I'm talking about the New Zealand government's response to the Christchurch terror attacks here. But his experience as someone who was fairly right to begin with, because he's, I believe, in a sort of a generally kind of libertarian frame of mind. His point of view is piss off and leave me alone. I don't care who you are. He also has a lot for recreational reasons to do with firearms, and his experience of the way that New Zealand handles firearms changing has been that it's been hugely depersonalized. Like, there used to be a regular, every time he imported a new gun, there was a regular cop who he talked to who was like the firearms guy for his area. And they had a really good relationship and they knew one another, and there was a sense of community there, which he felt, rightly or wrongly, was a limiting factor in terms of people being able to carry out terroristic actions with firearms, because there was someone there, if you wanted to import guns, who had to be in contact with you and was building a relationship with you and would get a sense that you were going sideways. So I think that sort of prioritization of tradition, and we know how to do things around here, there's not like no value in that.
yeah. Well, if we accept the left wing critique that the acceleration of the capitalist economy destroys the community bonds of people and deculturalizes zones and changes them into, airports and petrol stations, which are culturally differ in no way from any other space. That is a point that the right makes to support their position that it makes sense to support the traditional cultures that dwell in places because it's the right of those people to have access and to create their own cultural conditions. So it appears that the left and right agree on those two things. And to that point, I think it's worth bringing up, it's really interesting to see how the policy positions shift back and forth between being left-wing positions or right-wing positions. For example, environmentalism used to be a right-wing position because the left-wing position was, oh, it's only the upper class who have time to care about their fancy gardens and forests or whatever. And then that shifted after the International Socialist Organization started to fall into disrepair and sought for new allies outside of it, their kind of traditional working class zone. And that's when they brought in the environmentalists and the feminists and other single issue priority groups. And that's what caused the kind of starting of the Rainbow Coalition. And I think I see a similar thing happening with the interests of blue-collar workers, moving from, once upon a time, if you worked in the mines, you were a communist, and now, who represents your views, if you are a primary industries worker, if you can't say it's definitely the right, at the very least you can say it's definitely not the left anymore. And so
Yeah, and
I feel like there's a
that's,
major realignment coming up.
yeah, and that's interesting because and this is me reading leftiness into history, but there is a tradition of particularly in America, where the racial divide has always been very strong and very keenly felt because of the legacies of slavery, essentially. Um, there is a long tradition of um, capitalist interests, for want of a better term, uh, deliberately exacerbating identity tensions to make solidarity more difficult. So in
Yeah.
in the episode that I mentioned where the guy talked about there being like a battle with mine bosses, one of the things that was done as a deliberate strategy was um, making various staffing arrangements that would exacerbate between black and white workers,
Mm.
to make it harder for those workers to coherently organize.
Yeah, it's essentially
So, I
destructive to
mean,
trade unions to have those unions be multi-ethnic and composed of immigrants as well as whatever you call people who are not immigrants.
well, so I mean, and this is where I mean I might offer a point of disagreement. I don't know
Please
that
do.
it has to be.
Yeah.
There's a famous study. Well, I don't know if it's a famous study. There's a study that current right-wing demagogues, who I think would be cheerfully call themselves demagogues,
Mm-hmm.
like to cite to demonstrate that essentially race mixing causes instability and tension.
Mm.
So what was done was that people were asked about how they felt, basically, on their commute on a train, and Confederates uh, of the experimenters, who were of different races to the people who were being interviewed, were deliberately introduced into that journey over a period.
Mm-hmm.
And the finding that the right wing demagogues like to point out is that people reported an immediate spike in anxiety. But what they leave out is that as that study continued, the spike in anxiety fell away and people became much more comfortable seeing these different looking faces on their commute. So
Mm.
what you get is you get an initial spike of tension, but if you can weather that, then you come through that. And I mean, that's what you see
Oh, it makes sense.
arguably in Britain with the massive influx of like West Indian workers is
Mm.
that there's initial tension, but then you end up with the British Ska movement, which is all the white kids are going around to the West Indian kids' houses and listening to their parents' records. Like that happens surprisingly quickly.
I'm trying to thread this back to the 60s.
Yeah, that's that we've perhaps rambled some distance from where we initially started.
Were there any other points that you wanted to make about the 60s?
Well, I mean, I guess uh, there is the thread about vulnerability to things like conspiracism. That is a worry that I have about the modern world, and I see the roots of it in the willingness of people to be persuaded en masse by things like the Church of Scientology and the
Yeah,
People's Temple. Was that Jim Jones's outfit? Um,
I think so. Would you want to color that in for us and
well,
develop where
so
you see that thread coming from, where you see it going, and what troubles you about it?
my thesis, I suppose, is that the like the stuff about sexual liberation making space for sexual abuse, when unscrupulous people abused that, I feel like there was a similar kind of expectation of philosophical openness, and that led to uh, a an environment that made life easy for religious grifters of various kinds. Um, and I feel like uh, you can see that have tragic consequences in terms of, obviously, the Jonestown massacre is notorious. Um, Also, if people are less online than me, they might not know about the toll of Scientology. I guess that's increasingly well known, but that church had a huge impact on a lot of people, and it was overwhelmingly negative.
Hmm.
Um, and I feel like that um, that I guess encouragement to follow intuitive thinking uh, is what is leading um, modern New Age people to embrace things like uh, the Moriori or Celtic New Zealand theories in New Zealand, which, if you look into them at all, are fundamentally racist in their underpinnings.
Mm-hmm.
There's a goal there of undermining the position of Māori people in society, and making them out to be bad and deserving of bad things.
Yeah.
Um, and also, I feel like that same prioritization of intuition is what's leading more New Zealanders to get on board with things like David Icke and QAnon. And QAnon disturbs me because there have been terrorist incidents in the United States related to it, and New Zealand's not immune to weird terrorist incidents. And you
Mm.
know, returning to the Christchurch shooter, he was influenced um, by conspiracy theories that are part of the same ecosystem as Q, and all of that stuff worries me a bit, because I am starting to see people that I know tangentially and am in touch with for work reasons on the internet start saying very strange things, and it disconcerts me.
Well, looking at it from a solutions oriented perspective, it's a hell of a conundrum for you because it appears that the two options are either increase the amount of liberality, which would increase the amount of freedom that people have to involve themselves in wild speculations, conspiracies, media bubbles, and then indulge in whatever actions they see fit from that, or alternatively, clamp down on the availability of information, which is essentially an anti-liberal maneuver, and puts you in the position of returning to a tradition and saying there ought to be a single source of truth that is capable of validating or denying the validity of any information. So my hope is that you're going to give us a third way out of this trap.
I mean, you're right. That is a doozy of a pickle, because the tendency of the internet is to make everyone as loud as everyone else. The only, I guess, one way that I can see out of it, and this is a solution that some people are taking into themselves, and it's also a solution where, you know, there is very, very slow legislative moves in that direction, but legislative moves nonetheless, are attempts to break up or somehow, at the very least, defang the most enormous and powerful of the tech monopolies.
Mm-hmm.
Because one of the things that appears to be driving the recent boom in conspiracism is essentially automated engagement maximizing.
Mm-hmm.
The tendency to show people whatever's the most controversial, because we measure engagement, and that's the most important thing. I mean, it also has comedic effects. There was, I don't know if you're aware of the like weird kids YouTube scandal. There was this brief period of these channels spitting out largely automatically generated videos with like Spider-Man and Elsa gets pregnant, and then a doctor takes the baby out with an enormous pair of scissors.
Jesus Christ.
Then Venom invades the operating room and kicks Spider-Man, and Batman is also there, and it's like this weird free-for-all of unlicensed characters very badly rendered. That was like some companies, I think based in India, worked out a way to game the YouTube algorithm and make a lot of money in ad revenue very quickly, because like toddlers on YouTube Kids will just hit again if they recognize the Hulk in a video. And there was all this super weird shit.
That really is the cyberpunk future that we were promised.
Yes. Yeah, no, that is 100% some William Gibson bullshit.
Yeah. Wow, that's phenomenal. I hadn't heard of that.
There's look it up. There's some interesting stuff on it, and some people did some kind of video explainers which use little like snippets of the actual videos, and they are deeply weird.
Will I end up on a list if I watch them?
No. If you watch the explainer videos, you should be all right. And the actual videos, I think, YouTube worked out that because YouTube is a company that cares about people getting value for money on advertisements, they worked out that essentially this was dead money that they were charging advertisers, and the advertisers were going to be mad with them about it.
Yeah. And
so they tweaked things and suppressed that trend.
So capitalism worked, that's what you're telling me.
Eventually, once a lot of people went, holy shit, this is super weird. But I mean, you know, there have been largely ineffective and poorly informed attempts by the American government to look into the monopolistic way in which largely like the big two, Facebook and Google, operate. Because Twitter, although it seems like it's a big thing, is actually a surprisingly small market share.
Well, it's the position of this podcast that social media is a vile blight upon humanity.
Yeah, I mean, I am on social media largely because it's the easiest way to communicate with a number of people that I need to communicate with for various reasons. Were it not that, I probably wouldn't.
Well, the trend that I'm noticing is that for people who are interested in ideas, Substack is the way forward, because it removes the middleman of delivery and changes it into something that is less like a blog and more just like getting an email.
Yep, I think that's a big thing. I think also there's been a lot of movement towards Discords, because they operate a lot more like forums used to back in the old days.
Oh, it's a return to tradition. They're like chat rooms.
Well, I mean, a little bit, except I don't know. I haven't actually played around with Discord much. My sense is that it's even more forumy than that, in the sense that, like, I don't know that you necessarily see people respond to threads in real time the way that you would in a chat room.
Okay.
It's more like you read the list of responses to the thing, and then you can hit refresh and you can see if anyone's replied to what you said. I might be wrong about that, but certainly, like, the most functional discussions I have seen of stuff on the internet were on forums with really strong moderation cultures. Which, I mean, that is a control on speech, but also the thing about moderation rules on a forum was that those rules were quite clear, and because this was the pre-Facebook internet, if you didn't agree with them, there was a different forum that you could go and post on. And so, while I'm sure that there were people saying wild and outrageous things on the internet, there wasn't the tendency for those wild and outrageous things to spread really dramatically just because they were wild and outrageous.
Yeah, the R number was lower, so the virality never had the same velocity.
Yeah, no, I think the R number was lower, and also, like, Facebook in particular sort of aerosolizes the virus, if you want to stretch the metaphor.
Yeah, let's stretch it to breaking point. All right, well, I hope our listeners don't mind us engaging in some shop talk, but I'm interested in your opinion on where you think on the internet people can go in order to find the best ideas, and, related question, what's happening to podcasts? Because I get the sense that podcasts were the right place to find long format and deep discussions, at least for a while. Is that still true?
So, as to where the best place on the internet to go to find the right ideas is, that's a really difficult one. My solution has been to be very liberal about subscribing and very ruthless about unsubscribing. Because to lead into the second question, what appears to have happened to podcasts is that, like blogs, there was a brief period where you went to find real people talking about real things in a relatively unmediated way, because you didn't the technological buy-in is pretty low. We're recording this podcast on my phone and whatever computer you're using with OBS free software. I do have, like, an optional extra mic stuck onto my phone, but that's just because I bought it for other reasons, and it's there, so I might as well use it.
Yep.
And in fact, it was like under $200. It was like $110 or something like that. It was not, as microphones go, it was not that expensive.
Well, this effect is definitely being multiplied by elite overproduction. The fact is that the ecosphere of thought is being flooded with high-end rogue intellectuals, and dissident academic thinkers who don't have a home and can't find a way to get paid.
That's true. And the other thing that's starting to happen is that because I listen to a couple of podcasts which I enjoy, but which are on the iHeartRadio network,
Mm-hmm.
I hear ads for other things that are on the iHeartRadio network, and it sounds to me like uh, just listening to the way that they are being promoted, that there has been an expansion of like high production value rubbish
Mm.
into
Mm-hmm.
the space as well. Like, because it's really easy to make a podcast, lots of companies and pre existing media personalities have gone, oh, yeah, I could do that. And it's true, they can. But the what was for me the unique selling point of podcasts, which is that you get to listen in on a conversation or a lecture, perhaps depending on the person's style, with someone who's maybe not like super polished but has a really interesting point of view, is now um, becoming increasingly like spending an hour hanging out with like five commercial radio DJs, only they don't play songs because of copyright.
Jesus, what a
Yeah,
nightmare
yeah.
scenario.
And so that's happening to podcasts. The other thing I think that's happening with podcasts, we can lay at the door of Mark Maron. So Mark Maron is an American comedian. He's also a TV actor. He's on a bunch of different shows. If you want to see a good show with him in it, watch Glow on Netflix. It's called Gorgeous Ladies of Wrestling. It's
Mm.
a comedy about a very gimmicky all-female wrestling promotion in the 80s,
Mm-hmm.
and he plays the dodgy manager. But he was a fairly washed up comedian at the dawn of podcasting. And he started a podcast called What the Fuck, where he just interviewed people that he knew. And I think by a combination of being a pretty engaging interviewer, knowing some interesting people, and being in right at the start, he got super popular.
Uh-huh.
And so there's also a phenomenon where people who are or aspire to be comedians and don't have much going on in their day jobs will do podcasts in the hopes of being Mark Maron.
Yeah.
And so there are an awful lot of podcasts where like 2 to 4 probably white millennials have fairly inane conversations about things for like 2.5 hours.
I'm failing to see the pull factor for that approach, but
Well,
I guess they get
so am
listens.
I. But I mean, I think, yeah, I don't know if they get listens. Um, there must be something in it. I wonder if it's the spear phishing scam thing, where if you do it enough times, you get enough hits that the long tail becomes worth it. But you know, there's definitely a nonsense saturation happening,
Mm.
because a lot of people have caught on to the fact that it's very easy to make a podcast and put it out into the world.
Yeah. Well, because our audience is sophisticated, intelligent geniuses, I'm sure that they don't indulge in that kind of nonsense. Um, but the second question that I had asked you was, where do you see the if podcasting is coming to an end, and I don't know if you accept that or not, where do you see, or what is the format that is best for receiving new and thoughtful ideas and tracking down useful conversations?
That's a really difficult one, because I'm still kind of at podcasting. Like
Mm-hmm.
most of the political philosophical information I take in is either through podcasts or through effectively podcasts. So there be people who maybe do things on YouTube, but they're the kinds of things on YouTube that you could listen to more than you could watch. Um, and um, I the like a lot of people are shifting to models where they are uh, listener or viewer supported in some way, and so that they can, because people are essentially subscribing because they like the style of thing that happens.
Mm.
There is less of a less of a requirement to do a specific thing, and sometimes that works out. But it's difficult because certainly I would rarely see blogs. I am on Twitter, and occasionally there are interesting things on Twitter, but there's a lot of bullshit on Twitter.
Yeah.
You need you need a very strong bullshit filter on Twitter, um, and bullshit, and Twitter is also like the cyberpunk future that we were promised, in the sense that, like, if your timeline is sufficiently diversified, you will see someone having a genuinely insightful political discussion, someone else having an existential crisis, and a third person using the trappings of either left or right wing politics to essentially solicit for sex work, and those
Yeah.
will all be going on simultaneously. Um,
It's the Twitter to OnlyFans pipeline.
yes, yeah. Um,
All right.
and more power to them, I suppose. But it's definitely chaotic.
Yeah. Okay, let me run another idea past you. Camille Paglia makes the argument that uh, words and formats of media that are focused around words inherit the legalistic Abrahamic approach to the world, and that conversely, visual media and pictures therefore inherit a sort of pagan emotionality. If we accept that analysis, the shift from blog to video, which has happened with the increase of bandwidth in the internet, should indicate some variety of shift from Abrahamic to pagan, and I mean that specifically in Paglia's terms, from a legalistic approach to life to an emotional and intuitive one. And the reason why I bring this up is because it ties back to what you saw coming out of the 60s as a level of pro-intuition approaches. And if that's the case, then we would predict that in the future we would only see more of that variety of intuition-led, what's the word? How would you phrase it?
Yeah, I think I know where you're going. Yeah, so there's a really interesting phenomenon actually that I can point to directly. So there there was an ecosystem. Are you familiar with Gamergate, at least loosely?
Well, I've heard the term.
Okay, so basically, Gamergate it started as a harassment campaign against a specific female game developer by an embittered ex-boyfriend, and was adopted by the worst parts of the internet gaming community
Mm-hmm.
as an excuse to be vile about all women at all times.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and in response to that, there was this explosion of essentially grifters who told these people what that they wanted to hear in exchange for views, which
Mm-hmm.
equals ad revenue on YouTube.
Right.
And in response to that wave of grifters, there was a kind of a second wave of left wing commentators who initially started just picking these first wave of grifters to bits and explaining why they were wrong. But the interesting thing that's happened is that there's been this kind of three-stage so far life cycle to what they've done.
Mm-hmm.
They started basically doing straight to camera, like, this person said this thing and they're wrong about it, here's why discussions.
Mm-hmm.
They then progressed to, this person said this thing, and that points to a really interesting philosophical or artistic movement that I can now discuss for half an hour. And I hope that that illuminates why people have these arguments. And then the third phase is that they do that, but they also like simultaneously demonstrate the thing that they're talking about by staging like surreal skits with costumes and weird lighting and meta gags and all kinds of like one guy ended a video which was about the topic of the video was arguments that people have about web comics and what that shows us about the underlying culture of critique and how people engage in critique. But he finished the video being birthed out of a picture that he'd put onto his wall. Having gone through this escalating like series of strange kind of darkly psychedelic encounters with a masked figure carrying an axe, and that, so like there is this life cycle that appears to have happened in terms of people who have these conversations, at least on YouTube.
Well, it seems like the culture war industrial complex is both a hub of fascinating ideas, and here I'll give a shout out to Memes Matter, which is a YouTube channel that I enjoy, that does that well, I would say, and also the worst kind of abject pandering.
No, and I think it's really interesting to see, because it's a knife edge that these people are walking. I feel like if you went too hard into the kind of surreal theatrics, then you could lose yourself in them. But if you do it artfully, then maybe it heightens the impact of what you're doing. Maybe. But there are also people who've like attempted the same life cycle and failed, and are now like railing against the grand conspiracy that has kept them from success.
Oh yes, I think I've met those guys.
Yeah, it's kind of fascinating in a quite dark way. That thing about the shift to images, and so what does she mean by paganism?
I don't think she means it in the way that you would assume as sort of some variety of not Christian, except other than what she means, if I've interpreted Palia correctly, is that because the interpretation of images doesn't go through the sort of verbal matrix, instead it's much more a direct, intuitive, and emotional experience. So when you look at the Scream and you think to yourself, I've been horrified by something, you don't think about it in those words. Instead, you just have the direct emotional experience of it, which is why art is great. And whereas if you read a story and it says so-and-so was horrified, your experience of the horrification goes through that linguistic matrix. And so the shift is away from thinking about things in a rationally laid out, so far as rationally and laid out means linguistically interpreted, towards just emotionality and intuitiveness. And I want to try and discover more words that are in that theme, but they escape me right now.
Yeah, no, I get what you're saying. Yeah, I think that's true, and I think that that area of, I guess, pagan interpretation is another area where perhaps, at least for like the second half of the 20th century, the right wing had a really strong advantage, in the sense that they were unafraid to say, like, chicken will taste chickenier. We will give you back apple pie, or whatever the synecdoche of homeliness is.
Well, I definitely I definitely agree that one of the worst misunderstandings that the left has made about the right is thinking that the right is somehow just some sort of efficiency machine. They think that because they look at the neoliberals and and interpret that as being the right wing, whereas actually right wing thinkers have explicitly said that it's a rejection of materialism, and keep in mind that Marxism is historical materialism. It's a rejection of materialism and an investment in something that is higher and more pure than the material world that drives the kind of insight of most right-wing movements.
Yeah, well, certainly that is the emotional core that they appeal to,
Yeah,
and I guess that that's a thing that we can draw back to the '60s, to the point about this film projectionist who claimed to have not noticed it,
yeah,
is that um, I think you and I both participated in the rave culture of the late '90s and early thousands,
sure.
and that was profound for us in some ways, I think.
Mm.
But I don't think that we would claim that we could relate that experience to someone who was like getting up at the point that the sun was coming up in order to go and work at a bakery, for example.
Yeah,
And I think that, and this is where I wonder if the psychedelicization thing played a part in it, is that I feel like the hippies thought that people would get it if they could perceive it in the correct terms, and instead a lot of people looked at them and saw aliens from the planet Zog,
mm-hmm.
And utterly failed to get it, and got on board with their goals insofar as their goals appeared to align with biggest finger quotes in the world, common sense.
Mm. Well, there's definitely a direct link, both in terms of lineage and practice, from the early acid tests as practiced by, the Haight-Ashbury crowd and the beginning of the Grateful Dead and that kind of thing, and the free parties of the UK in the 90s. I don't think that that's really contested, that there's a direct link between those things. And if we were to go before that, where did the acid tests come from? I think they came out of a sort of, I don't know if it'd be fair to call it pop psychology, but a general feeling in the culture that the rationalization that was occurring in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War was dehumanizing individuals, and that a return to emotion and intuition was necessary, and that it wasn't good for people to ignore the body. And I interpret that as being affected by the sort of romanticist movements of Germany and the sort of Percy Bysshe Shelley and all of that going on in England. And if we and let me know if you think I'm going wrong on that point. But I think
that's a dot I was gonna join. I think you're entirely correct there.
Okay.
I think, and that's why I think, even though I don't know that Tolkien would have really agreed with the hippies, but the sort of mythic resonance of the Lord of the Rings really struck a chord with them, for example.
Well, as a traditionalist Catholic, I don't think that Tolkien would have agreed with the hippies, but there's no arguing that the hippies agreed with Tolkien, and he can't get away from that.
No, whether he liked it or not.
Yeah, he almost certainly would not have. But to go back in the other direction, so we've drawn this arrow back into the past, now let's extend it into the future, moving from Haight-Ashbury and the acid tests through the sort of mass festivals of the 70s, and then there was a few counter reactions against that, including disco, punk, and stadium rock, and then into the rave culture of the 90s and 2000s, where has that arrow ended up now? Has it split or is it still going? And where do you see it in the future?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question because
Thank you.
um, because I'm not sure where I do see um, that romantic tendency. What I do see, I suppose, is that um, in the after one of the other things that the internet did, particularly in spaces like Tumblr, was that it made like self-expression very easy.
Mm,
um, and so what you got is people becoming like intensely focused on like very specific discussions of kink and how to do kink safely and responsibly,
mm,
or people getting into like increasingly elaborate expressions of personal re-identification through things like the furries.
oh
Um,
God.
well, and but here's the thing: the furries have kind of gone all the way through comedy and out the other side, and are now like doing de-radicalization work and strange political praxis. It's very weird to watch.
One of the things that was predicted in uh, Gibson's first novel, not Necromancer, uh,
Neuromancer.
Neuromancer, was that in the future on the net, subcultures would arise and die away in the space of a single day. And I don't think we're quite at that yet, but it feels that we're heading in that direction. But the
Yeah,
counter argument to that is that subcultures don't exist anymore. It's impossible for them to exist because there's no place that is sealed off from everything else, which was a necessary predicate for the invention of subcultures. There will never again be a goth, is my point.
yeah. Although, I mean, there are I don't know if you would call them subcult. Well, what there are is that there are cultures that relate to specific sites and services that then bleed back into the rest of the culture. So, um, like my teenage, or no, I don't know if she would actually. I was about to say that my teenage daughter would say would type an F if something bad happened, um, but that is a thing that has. I wouldn't be surprised if she did. I don't know
Mm.
that she does. I wouldn't be surprised if she did, and that's a thing that's spread from specific, like a specific joke about one video game bled through Twitch streaming culture and
Mm-hmm.
has now just kind of infiltrated the whole of the internet. So there is this weird kind of very quick subcultural exchange.
So, do you think it's fair to say that subcultures have been replaced by hosting paradigms? So, whereas it used to be goth, rave, metal, rapper, skater, surfer, now it's Twitter, Twitch, YouTube, Reddit, Tumblr.
So I think yes and no. Yes, that's happened, but also like the hippies, the internet is smaller than it feels like it is. Um,
Ah, we might be
there,
falling prey to the same error that they made.
there are still um, people, as well as participating in these online cultures, are still often part of some or other kind of local culture. So, because I work at a radio station and people want their things on the radio, I am connected with a number of the local musicians in Palmerston North, and there are cultural specificities to that.
Mm.
Um, Despite the fact that these people are also online. So I think people can have multiple cultural specificities, if that makes sense,
It does.
and that um, there are some things that it's still impractical to do for whatever reason online, and people do in meat space, and there are cultural specificities tied to those.
Hmm. But in terms of the creation of future cultural zones for people to express themselves within in order to create more freedoms or opportunities for themselves, do you think that those are more likely to be sourced from the real world or from subculture or from abstractly online or from specific hosts?
I do think that there's probably going to be a shift towards specific hosts there, because um, if you're thinking about people trying to forge their own paths and do something independent of a pre-existing industry, then the major venue for doing that is online, and there, as we're saying, all of the vernaculars are kind of uh, either tied to a a style of content or tied to a host.
I think a really good way of mapping the thrust and the direction of this particular line of flight is one of your specialties, music. There was a time, and I can say this because I witnessed it firsthand, where a subculture and a genre of music were almost the same thing, or two expressions of the same thing, and that the creation of the internet completely smashed that paradigm where there was no reason not to listen to any genre that you felt like. And in the same way that the album has disappeared as a cultural artifact, I feel like the subculture has died to the same cause. So if the medium of expression of the future is the 20-second video, what, like, clearly the album is redundant, so in a similar way the subculture is redundant. And I'm not asking this question not because I'm interested specifically in subcultures, but because I'm interested in human culture and the creation of human culture in particular. My concern is that the machinic influence will be far stronger than the human influence in the cultural production methods of the future.
Yeah. So I guess I have two things to say about that, and they pull in opposite directions,
I like that.
which is that and so I guess where you end up depends on how you weight the directions that they pull in, I suppose. I think TikTok is a really good case study for this,
Mm-hmm.
because TikTok is new. I don't really get it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think a lot of people my age don't really get it.
Is it a micro
But
video sharing site?
yes, yeah, it's a micro video sharing site that was initially designed to allow you to choreograph dances to popular songs that were licensed in the TikTok library. And
Okay.
so it's had, so two things have happened. People have used it in the intended way, and it's caused artists to get really big because their song was being danced to a lot on TikTok, um, without them having had like mainstream radio play or lots of plays on Spotify or any of those other venues. So it's become a kind of cultural driver in that way. But the other thing that started happening on TikTok is that it started being used in ways counter to that initial intention. So people are using
Of
it for
course.
like comedy shorts. People are using it. There's a trend where people use it. They like strike poses and then superimpose text on the screen to make like brief, pithy political statements.
Mm.
Um, and so the two things that happen with something like TikTok is, firstly, it's incredibly democratized because anyone with a smartphone who downloads the app can do it, And while some people can do it much better than other people, and the usual multipliers in terms of physical attractiveness and skill at dancing and so on and so forth apply, um, it it's all of the people who have got big doing got big doing TikTok, and some people have got very big doing TikTok, have at the very least started with like factory gear, and a
Mm,
free app.
mm,
So that it's one of those things where probably the playing field will not stay level for very long, but it started very level and people are making lots of novel uses of it. But the second thing is, because it's a managed media ecosystem like Spotify, like YouTube, um, like Facebook, really, um, what is prioritized is in some ways what's trending, but also in some ways it's whatever the goals of the animating algorithm are decide should be trending. And so there's these twin um, pulls, one in the direction of everyone gets to do the thing and gets to do it as loud as everyone else. And if you can do the thing well, then you can have an impact and you can get heard. And another pull in the direction of this thing is owned by people who want specific stuff to happen so that they can make money. And also because TikTok is a Chinese owned app, there are always suspicions about its political functions.
right.
Um, because everyone is always suspicious of the Chinese government. Um,
Not unfairly, I would say.
no, no, but I mean, so you know, the same thing happened in the early days of YouTube, where it is arguably much less democratic now because some people are so entrenched in positions of influence,
Mm,
that they are unshakable, and other people, because they came in too late for content as niche as they are making to be popular, or as already represented as they are making to be popular, will never be popular. Um, but also the algorithm decides who sees what to some degree.
mm.
And I guess to take that to music, services like Spotify broaden but shallow people's listening habits. So people tend to listen to a much wider range of music than they did before, but they tend to spend much less time with any particular artist or style.
That's certainly been
Um,
my experience.
yeah, and mine too.
Mm,
Um, but the other thing that, and of course, Spotify pays a pittance, but the proliferation of tools to cheaply and reasonably professionally make music with a limited uh, requirement for outside influence has never been stronger. Uh, you can make a more professional record by yourself in your bedroom with very cheap equipment, um, than than someone could in a professional studio when Johnny Cash was recording, which is only 60 years ago.
mm.
Um, uh, and you have access to a service that, at least in theory, puts it in front of huge numbers of people. So in theory, it is democratized, although all of
Yeah,
those things about algorithms and pre-existing media weight.
it prior to the invention of recording technology, would it be fair to describe musician as a trade?
Yeah, I think so. I think so, in the sense that you are someone who learns a physical skill, um, and then provides that skill as a service within a reasonably geographically defined area. Um, I think maybe you could argue that, uh, with the ability to print sheet music reasonably easily, maybe songwriting becomes a profession
Mm,
at that point,
mm-hmm,
because you are then performing a mental skill which is mass produced, and you start making money off royalties and things like that.
mm-hmm.
But yeah,
So, in some sense, all of the technology that attempts democratization since the invention of recording technology is just trying to remediate whatever the original sin is in order to return us to the point where musicians could make enough to live, but never enough to really get famous, except for, you know, the very occasional Beethoven or whatever.
I mean, I suppose so. With the caveat that that the house always wins and has always won.
Yeah, okay, that's a fair point.
Yeah, that goes back to the beginning of recording as well, and presumably to sheet music. I imagine the people who printed and distributed the sheet music made a lot more money than the people who wrote the tunes.
Oh, I'm sure the ink makers and the paper makers were rolling in it. Okay, was there
Well,
anything else that you wanted to address?
no, I mean, I think we've covered a lot of ground, and I don't know how necessarily effectively I addressed my points, but I think I got them all, and you challenged them where they needed challenged. Yeah, I think that was good.
Very good. Traditionally, at this point in a podcast, apparently people offer their guest an opportunity to plug something. So if there's anything you'd like to plug, now would be a good time to do it.
Well, so I host a podcast of my own, which I have invited you on as a guest. It's usually briefer than this, although I don't know how much how ruthlessly you'll edit. It's called Reserved Recommendations, and it's about talking about things that you like but might not necessarily recommend for one reason or another. It's a classic, like, started during lockdown podcast because I wanted to talk to more people, and then also I wanted to use it as an excuse to talk to people who I wouldn't otherwise have a reason to bother. But if that sounds interesting, check that out. You can find that at mpr.nz/show/reserved, or you can search for it on Spotify because it's on there as well. Or for that matter, you can search for it on YouTube because the old episodes drop off the radio station's website. So I've been making very basic video versions of them and putting them on my YouTube channel just so that they're somewhere else.
Fantastic. I unreservedly endorse that podcast for our listeners.
Brilliant. The other thing is, if you would like to hear odd sounds that I make infrequently, wolfboy.bandcamp.com is where I put any music that I make, which I, as I say, do not as often as I feel I should, but I mean, isn't that the way of all creative endeavors?
Yeah, that's the curse of the creative, I'm afraid.
Yes, yeah. And all of the stuff that I put up there is put up as pay what you want, including $0. So if you wish to help yourself to it for free for whatever purpose, go for your life. That is up there, and you can do that as well.
Well, you've been very generous with your time, and I thank you for it.
Oh, well, thank you for having me.